and more learning this morning in Leilu Nishmas Harav Simcha Yerachmiel ben Mordechai, a devoted legendary shliach and the father of our classmate Nechamadina Turk. And we're also learning in honor of the bris of the baby born to Leah and Daniel Clements. We'll have a bris milah shortly. And we are delighted to wish Mazel Tov to Rachi Shem Tov upon becoming a grandmother again. And we wish Arichas Yamim V'Shanim Teves to all the people whose birthdays are being celebrated around this time. We're learning the Sicha on Parshas Masei. Aleph. Yiduim Divrei Hashalah B'negei LeParshas Matos Umasei Udvarim. This is a theme that the Rebbe references over and over and over again, that the Shalah taught that the Parshas are thematically linked and aligned inherently with the time of the year. And regarding the Parshas of this coming week, this week, Matos and Masei, it's known what the Shalah said, Shehem Tamid Cholim Bein HaMitzarim, that they always fall out during this time of Bein HaMitzarim, during the 3 weeks, because it is davar be'itai, it's thematically or conceptually aligned with his time of year. And he explains there at length the connection between these parshas and this time of Bein HaMitzarim. Now, we have a unbelievable sikha ahead of us, very much the vibes of the iconic sikha around Miriam Bas Bilga. So we're not going to take that much time to unpack this, but since the Rebbe says that it's Yadua, and there's a footnote that tells us that in Chelek Yud Ches, you could find what the connection is. So very, very quickly, the Rebbe brings down in that Sikha in Chelek Yud Ches on Parshas Matai Masei, he explains that the Shalah explains that a few things. One is that in Parshas Matai it talks about the chait of Nedarim or a Shvua, and this is Pagea b'neshama. If this kind of trespass can harm the soul, can maim the soul. And then in Parshas Masei, we have a discussion about the chait of Ritzicha, of murder, and that harms the body. And these two inyanim, these two chatoim, these two sins, cause the chorban of the Batei Mikdash, which is what we are mourning now. Another explanation is that the shaychus, the connection between these parshas to Bein HaMitzarim, is that it's not just that it hints to the reasons for the destructions of the Batei Mikdash, but it gives us kaiches and tells us what our avodah is during this time. And also explains that in Parshas Matais, Moshe talks to Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven about the Chet HaMeraglim, for which reason the Jews remained in the Midbar for 40 years. And remaining in the desert for 40 years is an inyan of Golus. And then in the beginning of Masai, it talks about the Masais, it talks about the different trips and the different stations where the Jews rested. And famously, we know the Medrash and Rashi references this, that all the places where the Jews stopped that are delineated are a veiled reference to the places where they sinned. And this too is a reason for Golus. So this is a little bit of what the Shalah explains on the shaychus between these parshas and Bein HaMitzarim. Going into the second paragraph of today's Sikha, V'al pi hamavur kama pa'amim. And based on what has been explained many times, B'negei l'zman Bein HaMitzarim, about these 3 weeks. Shadavka bizman zeh yesh lekayim achake loy bechol yom sheyavoy b'hischaskus yisera. That specifically, yes, thank you, Elza. I will try to use less Hebrew expressions. Thank you for that important reminder, and my apologies. That is specifically in this time that we have to strengthen this idea of waiting for Mashiach every single day. V'lachein misugolim yomim ele b'yoser lelimud meseches midos v'hilchos beis habechira. And that's why these are auspicious days during which time to learn the part of the Gemara and the Masechta of Midos that talks about the building of the Beis Hamikdash, and also the writings of the Rambam, the halachas about building the Beis Hamikdash. Me'achar she'al yedei halimud va'esek betzuras habayis utchunasoi u'meitzav u'muva'av v'chol tzurasav v'eskol chukosav azay ani mala aleim ki'ilu him oiskim mevinim habayis. And why is this an auspicious time, an important time to learn these halachas about the building of the Beis Hamikdash? Because, as the Rambam brings down, that when you learn about the construction and the exact architecture of the Beis Hamikdash and its exits and its entrances and its subsidiary structures and all of the rules surrounding the building of the Beis Hamikdash, then Hashem says, I reckon unto you as if you actually were involved in building the Beis Hamikdash. So learning it is reckoned as if we are involved in the building of the Beis Hamikdash. Move on. Shebeparshias Eila Matas Masei Udvarim Merumaz Loirak Inyan Havelos Mitzat Korban Habayis Uchule Elagam Inyan Hagula Ubefrat B'Shaychas Lebinyan Habayis. So once we understand that this is, yes, a time of mourning, but as the Rebbe taught us over and over again, this is a time to strengthen our waiting for Mashiach to come and to make it, to concretize it, and to make it real. And as the Rebbe said in the Sikha in Chelek Yud Ches, from which I read, or I tried to translate very, very quickly, the Rebbe says it's not just a time of mourning, it's a time of koyach, of strength and chizuk, and giving us the necessary tools, the emotional tools, the psychological tools for which to overcome the galus and to welcome Mashiach. And so therefore, these themes have to be found in the parshas that are aligned with this time as well. Va'amna matzinu bir me adaini avi meiri v'rabi. And in fact, we find an explanation from my father, my teacher, my master, B'kesher lepasuk de parshasenu, in connection with a verse in our parsha regarding the Arei Miklat, the cities of refuge to which an inadvertent murderer would run in order to save themselves from possible revenge on the part of the family of the victim. And that verse in this week's parsha is V'yeshiv ba admais hakayin hagadol. And the murderer, the inadvertent murderer, should remain exiled in the city of refuge until the death of the high priest. Shemimenu yesh lilmoid toisefes bir bahalacha hashayeches lebinyan habayis k'lekaman siv dalid ve'elach. And the Rebbe says that from the explanation that my father gave on the pasuk, on the verse in this week's parsha, that the inadvertent killer should remain in the city of refuge until the high priest dies, we're going to be able to deepen our understanding of a law that has to do with the building of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so in and of itself, this is already fascinating, this intersectionality between a verse in the parsha and a halacha in the building of the Beis Hamikdash. Beis. Beperek Aleph de Hilchos Beis Habechira. Pasuk HaRambam. In the very first chapter of the law surrounding the building of the Beis Hamikdash, the Rambam lays down the law, he adjudicates, Ve'ein boinin boi behechol ba'azara eitz boilet klal. And in the sanctuary, meaning in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Holy Temple, and in the surrounding courtyard, you do not build with wood that protrudes or that is prominently visible. Ella, oy ba'avanim, oy bilvenim v'sid. Rather, either with stone or with brick and mortar. The Haravid Heisigalav, the Kasav, and the Ravid actually takes the Rambam to task, as it were, and he writes, "V'haloi lishkas kohen gadol shel eitz haisa." We know famously that there was a lishka, there was a room set aside for the kohen gadol that was made of wood. And as the Mishnah says very clearly, she'echad halishka shebazara haisa lishkas ha'etz shehi lishkas kohen gadol. So there were all these kind of rooms or cubicles, and one of them was called lishkas ha'etz, the room made of wood, and this was the room that was set aside for the kohen gadol. So how could it be that the Rambam lays down the law that there should be no wood prominently seen or displayed or visible in the entire kind of campus of the Beis Hamikdash? And here we have a clear Mishnah that says that there was a room made out of wood. And it wasn't an unimportant room where they stored something abstruse. It was the room set aside for the Kohen Gadol. Yesh mefarshim shalishkas eitz eina asuya eitzim. The Rebbe says there are some commentators that explain that although it's referred to as lishkas ha'etz, the room or the cubicle made of wood, it actually wasn't made out of wood. But rather, this is a euphemism that was given to this room for various reasons. But the Rebbe says it's really hard to embrace this explanation. Kohen Gadol b'shem lishkas eitz ve'ein kan mekoymai. Hare lishkas eitz b'pashtus peirusha shal lishka nesesa me'etz. The Rebbe says, aside from the fact that, according to my humble opinion, the reasons given by the commentators as to why this cubicle that wasn't made out of wood would be called the cubicle of wood, and the Rebbe says, basically, I'm not impressed with the reasons they give, but simply speaking, if you call something a cubicle made out of wood, that means it's made out of wood. V'yesh loymar, we might say, Sharambam atzmoi yoshav koishi zeh b'diuk l'shoinoi. And we might say that the Rambam himself reconciles this question if you look at the specificity, which the Rebbe always did, the specificity of Rashi, the specificity of Rambam, the specificity of Al Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, every single word and every single nuance. So the Rebbe says if you look at the specificity of the Rambam's wording, he says ve'ein boinin boy eitz boilet klal. You don't build with wood that is prominently visible. Why would he have to put in the word prominently? Ukavir hamifarshim. So the commentators explain, shebe'etzem b'nias eitz b'vinyan leika eser. The truth of the matter is that there is no prohibition on building with wood. But rather, the prohibition is on building with wood that is prominent, that is visible, that protrudes, that is recognizable. Umakar divrei harambam b'meseches Rosh Hashanah. And the source of the Rambam's explanation that the Rebbe just cited is found in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. Te'isa sham b'Gemara ala pasuk vayiven Shlomo Melech es hachatzer pnimis Ezra's Kohanim ve'Ezras Yisrael. The Gemara comments on the pasuk, and this is a pasuk from Melachim Aleph, that it says that Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, built the inner courtyard, which was the area for the priests, the Kohanim, and also an area for the Jews, the pedestrian Jews. And what did he build it of? Shloisha Ture Gazes, 3 rows of hewn stones, of carved out stones, Vitor Krisus Arazim, and 1 row of cut cedar. Okay, so he built it out of wood. And the Gemara comments on this. Sheshleimai Shake Bivinyana, he embedded the wood, he put the wood deeply into the structure, and sadye besida, and then he plastered it over with mortar, with cement. Mana es isur de eitz boilet, and in this way he circumvented the prohibition of the wood being prominently displayed. So based on this, the Rebbe says we could simply say that the cubicle that is called the cubicle of wood was indeed, in fact, made of wood. And nevertheless, there was no prohibition here, because the wood was put in deeply into the structure, and then it was plastered over with plaster. In order that the wood should not be prominently displayed. Okay. So now the Rebbe has given us a way of understanding something about this cubicle that is called Lishkas Ha'etz, even though there is this halacha that you can't have wood prominently displayed in the Beis HaMikdash. And he explains that it was made of wood, this cubicle where the Kohen Gadol would be sequestered and do other things. It was made of wood, but it was plastered over. Gimel. But the Rebbe says, "Vadayan ain't move on," but it's still not understandable. In other words, it's almost like we raised more questions than we reconciled here with this conversation. Hare kol zehu rak tam maspik ala heter livnois lishka me'etzem. All of this is just to be more comfortable with the idea. It's just to reconcile how you could, in permissible fashion, build a cubicle out of wood. Ela shetzarech bir, but we need explanation. Mahu hatzarech milichatchila livnois es halishka me'etzem dafka, va'achar kach lachasoisam besid, v'loi me'avodim ulevenim bilvad kishar halishkais. But wait a minute. Why do we need to build this particular cubicle differently from all the other cubicles that were built out of stone? Why, to begin with, build this one out of wood, then you need to plaster over the wood? What's the imperative for this particular cubicle or room to be built out of wood? Ubetama davar kasav hataisvus yomtiv. And the reason for why it had to be made out of wood is provided by the Tosfos Yomtiv. Shezeu al derech divrei haGemara. Bevir hatam shel lishkos hazara nikva'u ba'ofen hagorim tircha yisera l'kohen gadol b'avodasa b'yom kippurim. And the reason that the Tosfos Yomtiv gives is aligned with the reason that the Gemara gives for why the various cubicles that the Kohen Gadol, that the high priest, had to enter and exit and take various things from those different cubicles, why they were, to begin with, set up at a distance from each other. In other words, you would think that since Yom Kippur was the apex of spiritual service in the Beis HaMikdash, and the Kohen Gadol was the one who effectuated all of this avodah, so you would think that when the Beis HaMikdash was built, you would accommodate that, and you would put all the various cubicles that the Kohen Gadol had to go in and out of, things he had to take, things he had to bring, he had to get dressed and undressed, we know 5 different times. So why put the various cubicles that he had to enter and exit from at a distance from each other? in the parentheses, sheyitzdarech leleches ana va'ana mitzafon l'darim midarim l'tzafon. He had to go back and forth, seemingly wasting time on this holy of holy days, and go from the north to the south and from the south to the north. And the Gemara says, why? Kidei shaloi tazuach datay alav. In order to make sure that he doesn't become arrogant, to guard against hubris, because the Kohen Gadol was the center of all of the Avodah. So there's a danger that a person will become consumed by their self-importance. So one of the ways in which this was addressed was by making the Kohen Gadol walk back and forth from place to place, keeping him humble. Shelo yizga'eh b'keser kahuna, in order that he shouldn't be arrogant with his crown of priesthood. And so it is with what we're discussing here, according to the Tosfos Yom Tov, Kidei shaloi tazuach datay olav asuya lishkasai v'loy me'avonim ela me'etz. In order that the Kohen Gadol should not become too arrogant, the cubicle that is his, not a cubicle that he's going to enter or exit or use or see, but the cubicle that is assigned to him is made not out of stones, but out of wood, which is a lesser type of material. Okay, that's the Tosfos Yom Tov explanation. But the Rebbe says, but seemingly, ein ze bir maspik. This is not enough of an explanation. Okay, good. The Rebbe says we understand that we have to take pains that the Kohen Gadol should not become too arrogant. But you don't have to overdo it. There's no mitzvah to be mahader in this, to do this with such force, to beautify this idea and go the extra mile to not make the Kohen Gadol arrogant. Why do you have to do it in such a way? It's almost that if you go this far as to assign a cubicle of wood to the Kohen Gadol, you're not only are you guarding against his hubris, you are casting a disparaging light on him. Maybe he's not deserving of anything better than a cubicle made out of wood. And this is aligned with what it says in the Mishnah. And this is a very sad thing. It says in the Mishnah in Yuma that in the times when the Kohanim Gedolim were corrupt, and we're going to be speaking about that a lot in this Sikha, the elders had to come to the Kohen Gadol, and they made him take a vow that he would not deviate from the proper service that he had to effectuate on Yom Kippur. And this was a very hard thing to do, to go in and speak to the Kohen Gadol, supposed to be the holiest person amongst the Jews, and make him swear that he's going to do the right thing. And the Mishnah says, Hein parshin uvoichin. They would turn away and they would cry that they were forced to make the Kohen Gadol swear that he would do the right thing. They cried al shechashdu b'kach, that they even had to suspect that he might not do what he was supposed to do. Ubefrat, and especially, why should you put the Kohen Gadol in a cubicle made of wood in order to guard that he doesn't become arrogant? Especially, we already have other ways in which we are doing that. We already reference that he would have to go to and fro and spend time walking from the north to the south and so on and so forth. And they used to sequester him for 7 days. And this also, Rashi says, sorry? And one of the reasons for this was that he shouldn't become arrogant. Question mark, exclamation, sorry. So on top of all the other safety valves that were put into place, that the Kohen Gadol should not become too sure and too pompous, now you're also going to assign him this anomalous space made out of wood rather than stone for all the days of the year? Like the Rebbe is saying, there has to be a better reason. Dalet. Vehine baha'areisav l'masechet midas. Kasav Adoni Avi Meiri Verabi. In his annotations to Masechet Midas, my revered father, teacher, and guide wrote, Shalishkas Kohen Gadol Nikreis Lishkas Ha'etz, Rak Kol Zman Shekahanim Gedolim Hayukshem Tzadikim She'arichu Yamim K'moi Shimon HaTzadik. Rebbe says, my father wrote that this cubicle was referred to as the cubicle of wood only during the era when the high priests were pious and they lived for a very long time, like Shimon HaTzadik. Avaloi la'achre yemei Shimon HaTzadik, but not after that era when there was a succession of corrupt high priests. She'az hechlifu eshma shalishkas Kohen Gadol. That was when they changed the name of this cubicle, the Lishkas Parhedron. They called it by a Greek name, the cubicle of the Parhedron. Note, yes, there is a similarity to Sanhedrin. And Parhedron means officers of the king that would be on a rotation, and they would be switched every year. And why was it called Lishkas Parhedron? Ki noisnin olav mamay lekahuna umachlifin oisa kol shnei masar chodesh ki Parhedron halalu shemachlifin oisam kol shnei masar chodesh. The reason it was called the cubicle of the Parhedron was because the high priest alighted to this stature not in the way that was ideal, which was through their greatness and through their piety, but rather they bidded for this office. It was an auction, and the one who could give the greatest amount of money became the Kohen Gadol. And because they were not worthy, they would die in the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom Kippur. So that means that every 12 months you had a new Kohen Gadol, just like the Parhedron that were switched every 12 months. Umevar and my father explains there, the eitz meir al arichas yamim, k'may shekasu b'Yeshayahu, simin or perek samachei, k'mei ha'etz yimei ami. And my father explains the connection between why it was called Lishkas Ha'etz, the cubicle of wood, during the time when the high priests were pious and lived a very long time. Because in Yeshayahu, there is a verse that says, like the days of the tree are the days of my nation. That trees live for a very long time. And for this reason, when the Kahanim Gedalim were pious, so this cubicle, this space, was referred to as Lishkas Ha'etz, the cubicle of wood, because they lived for a very long time, and this speaks to the fact that they were very pious. Sham Adaini Avi Meiri Verabi, and my father further explains the Kohen Gadol Shayach La'arichas Yamim, and the whole office of the high priest is aligned with the idea of elongated life, of long life. Ki arichas yamim nimsheches miyamin, like we say erich yamim b'mina, because the energy for long life comes from the right side of spiritual energies, as we reference every time we finish reading from the Torah, and we lift it, and then we roll it back. We reference the pasuk from Mishlei that long life is on the right, and the right is aligned, bechinas chesed, is aligned with kindness, with goodness, because Kohen Gadol hu bechinas chesed, Kohanim are about chesed, Leviim are about gevura. That's just Nothing to do with the sikha. Okay. Umevi raya lazeh shenyane shel kohen gadol hu arichas yamim, and my father brings down a proof that the whole energy of the high priest is about long life. Mimaimer razal b'negea lahirig nefesh b'shgaga, from something that the Gemara teaches about somebody who killed inadvertently, which brings us back to this week's parsha, right, where it talks about the cities of refuge for the inadvertent murderer. And there is a teaching that teaches shahadinhu shechayev lihishar be'ir miklatay ad ma'isa kohen gadol, that the murderer, the inadvertent murderer, had to remain in the city of refuge until the high priest of that time passed away. And what's the explanation? Because a murderer shortens the days of a person, and a high priest elongates the days of a person. So it's not right that you should have somebody who shortened the life of somebody walking around freely in the presence of somebody who's all about elongating people's lives. V'yesh loymar, and we might say, שההיספה והראיה שזהו עניינו של כהן גדול מערך ימיו של אדם, היא גם ההיספה ביישוב השאלה הנ"ל. And we might say that this additional explanation that my father gives to explain the connection between the Kohen Gadol and long life will help us understand the question that we asked above, which is, Madua haisa lishkas kohen gadol b'nuya me'etzim dafka. Why would the cubicle assigned to the high priest be built specifically out of wood? Hadavar ba. So the Rebbe says, based on my father's explanation, we can understand that calling it, making it out of wood, and referring to it as a cubicle of wood comes loirak lerames al yidei shem eitz oides arichas hayame bepoel shal kahanim agdolim shahayu tzadikim. It's not just to allude to the fact that the pious high priests lived long lives, like a tree lives a long life, ela lahadgish, but it comes to underscore shezehu in yonoi shel kohen gadol bechol hazmanim, beinim hakohen hagadol ha'erech yamim bepoel ubein in lav, to teach us that this is in general and for all time the energy of a Kohen Gadol, whether that particular Kohen Gadol actually lived a long life or did not. Ukidin, and as the halacha that was cited above is, v'yashav ba ad ma'isa Kohen Gadol. And the halacha, the law, that the inadvertent killer has to remain in the city of refuge until the Kohen Gadol dies, that's for all time. שהוא בכל הזמנים, גם בזמן שהכהן גדול לא יארך ימים, ולכן נבנתה לשכת כהן גדול מעצם דווקא. And this was the law for all time, even if the Kohen Gadol did not live for a long time, which, as we're going to see later, kind of points to the fact that he was not pious. But either way, still, the office of the Kohen Gadol is aligned with elongated life, and therefore his cubicle was built out of wood. Hey, but don't worry, the Rebbe is not going to leave us here and is not satisfied with this, even though we now have a deeper explanation as to why this cubicle had to be made out of wood. Not enough. But we need more of an explanation, especially on the deeper level, al pi Chassidus. Okay, so now the Rebbe has done a good job of explaining the alignment between the idea of wood and Kohen Gadol. So if so, so then if wood is so intuitively correlated with the energy of a Kohen Gadol, so then why do you have to plaster it over? Why would you do that? It's true that there's a halacha that you're not allowed to build with wood that is going to protrude, that is going to be prominently displayed. So yeah, that would be the technical reason as to why it has to be plastered over. But the Rebbe says, "Aval harei kol prat b'mikdash hu b'tachlis hadiyuk umatim l'toichen ha'inyan." But that's not satisfying at all, because we know that every single detail of the Beis Hamikdash was built with exquisite attention to the content for which that part of the Beis Hamikdash would be used. So we have to say so based on that, we have to say that the fact that the wood has to be covered over with plaster is not a technical way of addressing a halacha that the wood can't be prominently displayed, but there has to be a conceptual, deep reason for why this cubicle has to be made out of wood and the wood has to be covered with plaster. There has to be a lesson here that although the Kohen Gadol is aligned with the idea of wood, but the wood has to be covered. And this begs for explanation. It's one thing if you want to talk about the era when the high priests were not pious, and therefore they did not live long. So it's understood why the wood should be covered. Because during that era, the idea that a Kohen Gadol lives for a long time was obscured. It wasn't something that people saw in manifest fashion. It was behelim, it was shrouded. And therefore, in fact, they did not call that place the cubicle of tree, of wood. But this doesn't satisfy, because the wood being covered with plaster was true even during the time that the Kohanim Gedolim were very, very pious and lived for a very, very long time. ובפרט שדווקא שנים אלה היו שנים כתיקונם, כשהכהן הגדול היה מתאים מה שנאמר ויבדיל ארון קודש קודשים. During those times, the Kohanim Gedolim were so pious. They were so aligned with how they are described as that Aaron separated them from the rest of the Jews. They were the holy of the holies. So why should the cubicle assigned to the Kohen Gadol be made out of wood? Okay, so now we understand that wood is about elongated life, but that's plastered over. Vav. In other words, maybe the plaster should have been applied after the era of the pious Kohanim Gedolim, or during the years where the Kohanim Gedolim were corrupt. But that's not what occurred. Vav. And we'll understand this by first explaining the teaching that was referenced above. Shinu Hashem Lishkas Kohen Gadol LeLishkas Parhedron. That after the passing of Shimon HaTzadik, they changed the name of this cubicle from the cubicle made out of wood to the cubicle of the Parhedron. Mishum she'kahanim gedolim hayu mischalfim b'chol shana keparhedron halalu. Because the Kohanim Gedolim were a revolving door. Every year there was a new one, just like these officers that would be switched out every year for the king. The Eina Mechaver, Rebbe says it's not computing. Gam la'achri zman Shimon HaTzadik hayu kama Kohanim Gedolim shayu tzadikim barichu yamim al kol panim yosem yud beis chodesh. even after the time of Shimon HaTzadik, when we already get into a time where there are a lot of Kohanim Gedolim that are corrupt, and they live for a very short amount of time because they pass in the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom Kippur, but there were still a few Kohanim Gedolim that were tzaddikim, and they lived for longer years, at least longer than 12 months. The lama yikru Kohanim Gedolim elu b'shem kazel lishkas parhedrin hamadgish es rishu shara Kohanim Gedolim shagormu shemachlifin oisa kol yud beis chodesh. So why should these pious Kohanim Gedolim, as few and far in between as they were, but why should they be tarred with the same brush? Why should the place where they are sequestered be known as a Lishkas Parhedrin, which underscores something negative, right? It underscores a negative aspect of the rest of the Kohanim Gedolim that were corrupt. L'chayra. Seemingly, haya efshar levar lefi ma shekvar nizbar kama pa'amim. Perhaps we might apply the explanation that has been given a number of times already. Shezeh shahayu machlifim oisam kol shneim asar chodesh moira al mala b'kohanim gedolim ela. Okay, so this is something that only the Lubavitcher Rebbe can do. That's what I said earlier, that this is like the Miriam Bas Bilga Sicha. The Rebbe says, and I've already referenced it before, you could see also in Chelek Yud Ches, where the Rebbe teaches that the Kohanim Gedolim were switched out every 12 months, actually points to something wonderful about them. Okay? Now, the rest of the world, for all of the generations of Jewish history, everybody understood this as like proof positive of how corrupt these Kohanim Gedolim were. But the Rebbe comes and says, no. Even though they saw that the previous Kohen Gadol, who bid the highest amount of money and therefore became the Kohen Gadol, so he was corrupt, and he did not live out the year. Mikol Makom hishtadlu v'nasnu mamayin kedei lismanus Kohanim Gedolim. And yet, still in all, knowing full well that they too would die, they bid tremendous amounts of money to be able to alight to this very office. Seemingly, this is a great wonder. Because everybody, let's be honest, everybody knows who they are, right? So these Kohanim Gedolim, they knew that they were not worthy, which was why they had to buy this station, because they were not worthy. So he knows he's not going to live out the year. He knows that just like the Kohen Gadol from last year died because he wasn't deserving, he's going to die. So why does he covet this station so badly? Why does he yearn to be a Kohen Gadol? He knows it's going to be the end of his life. But the explanation is Goydel cheftzam v'tshukasam lihikones lekodesh hakadoshim b'yom kippurim sheboy shira hashchina ba'ofen gluya. Their yearning, their yen, their desire to go into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, where Hashem's presence rested in manifest manner. They had such a great yearning to do this that they made a cost-benefit analysis, and they said to themselves, to be able to witness the Shekhinah resting in a way that I can see on Yom Kippur in the Holy of Holies, so I'll die. It's worth it for me. Shenikra lishkas kohen gadol b'shem lishkas parhedrin Gam bizman de kohanim gedolim kishev v'tzadikim. Now, in light of this radically new understanding of these kohanim gedolim, who were always just seen as arrogant, corrupt people who felt they could buy anything they wanted and had no regard for the holiness of the station. But the Rebbe has come now and said, no, look at these Jews. They so wanted to be in the manifest presence of God in the holiest place of the world, on the holiest day of the year. They were ready to die for this. So now we understand why that cubicle was called Lishkas Parhedron, which points to the fact that the people who were sequestered here would be switched out every year, like the Parhedron, because it underscores something great about them. And that is why even for those Kohanim Gedolim that were pious and righteous, that space was still called Parhedron. Because because with this is underscored the enormity and how much should be cherished the opportunity to enter the Holy of Holies, afilu pam echas v'yechida, even if only one time, and even if it causes death. And so having this space named the cubicle of the Parhedron, Lishkas Parhedron, would evoke a greater yen in the pious and righteous Kohen Gadol. Shekfar nichnas kama pa'amim l'kodesh HaKadoshim. Although he went in a number of times already that into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but it would teach him shekol knisa dehe yikara v'chashuva be'enov ki'ilu nichnas pam yichida zubavad. It teaches that every time that he goes in should be so precious and so important in his eyes as if it's the only time that he'll ever go in. And I don't like to editorialize, but I can't resist the urge to just say that these words that the Rebbe says, afilu pam achas v'yechida, even one and only time, the Frierdiker Rebbe used these words when he explained, when he was taken to task for making a covenant with the 9 Hasidim, and one of them to set up and to watch over the mikvahs in Russia under the communist regime. And they said to him, how could you do this? You know that the communists are going to fill the mikvah. As soon as it's built, they're going to fill it with concrete. And Frierdiker Rebbe said, if one woman goes one time, it's worth it. I see there are a number of questions, but I've been asked to address the questions afterwards, so please forgive me. I'm just trying to take marching orders. But either the questions will be resolved, or we'll look at that first thing after the Sikha. Zayin. Aval l'chayra ein ze bir maspik. But seemingly, this is still not enough of an explanation. D'seif seif maskir shem zes hanhaga bilti v'tzuyish l'kanim v'deilim. Okay, you gave us a radically new, breathtaking explanation. But still, there's residual negativity attached to the name Parhedron. Ubichlal, ma bokem yesh l'kvoya shem ha'ma'or b'golei hefech schusum shel Yisrael. And why would you, to begin with, put a name on a space in the Beis Hamikdash that evokes the opposite of merit for Jews? Because look, it still has negative connotation. V'yeser al kain, and even more. Lishkas kain gadol nisyasda beikar b'shvil shivas hayam shebehem hayu mafrishin as a kain gadol prisha va'aliyah legabe shar b'nei Yisrael. The room called Lishkas Ha'etz, or Lishkas Parhedron, the cubicle that was set aside for the high priest, was to begin with put aside mainly for the 7 days that the high priest would be sequestered leading up to Yom Kippur. And Prisha V'Aliyah L'Gabe Shar B'nai Yisrael. And this was about separating him, and elevating him above all the rest of the Jews. And when was this? Ubizman Daseres Yemei Tshuva. And it was during the days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And we know that during that time you have to be extra careful not to say anything negative about another Jew. שבעניין פרהג'ן מחליפן אייסם כל 12 חודש, יש גם פירוש עיקרי למעליוסה בצד הקדושה. So we're forced to say that the idea of parhedron, which points to the idea that they were switched out every 12 months, has an inherently positive connotation, something holy. And what is that? Da'afal pisha b'muvan ha'pashu b'negei l'kama v'kama kahanim gedolim achin hayazeh inyan bilti ratzoi hefach harichas yamim. Hine inyan zeh deparhedron esel kahanim gedolim k'shem tzadikim she'richu yamim haya maila gedola. Okay, so the Rebbe says that the word parhedron, for those kahanim gedolim that were corrupt, it's true. It had a negative connotation, even though the Rebbe changes around the whole thing by telling us how much Mesiras Nefesh they had. But still, there's a negative connotation for them. But for the Kahanim Gedolim that were righteous and pious, there's a tremendous virtue that is embedded in this term. And what is it? Seif Ches. V'yesh loymar habir bazeh. We might say that this is the explanation. Nekudas avodas hakayin gadol b'yom kippurim hi avodas hatshuva. The central theme of everything that was done by the Kohen Gadol in the Beis Hamikdash on Yom Kippur was tshuva, repentance. The Rebbe doesn't like that word. Returning. Ve'echad hamaylis shebavodas hatshuva l'gabe avodas hadikim hi shavodas hatshuva hi b'derech hischatshus. And one of the virtues that tshuva has over the spiritual service of tzaddikim, because as is well known, when the Rebbe speaks about tzaddikim and bali teshuva, he is in the main not referencing sociological categories, those people that are FFB from birth and those people that became observant later. He is talking about two modalities of serving Hashem. There's the avodah of tzaddikim and there's the avodah of bali teshuva. And he says that it's well known that one of the virtues of the avodah of the Baal Teshuvah, of the person that is returning to Hashem, is this idea of novelty. This idea that it's not like you're just chugging along, same, but there's a radical innovation that's baked into the idea of Teshuvah. It's true. You're right. That it says about tzaddikim that they go from strength to strength and that they have no respite, they have no rest because they're always going from one level to another level. It's true they go from plane to plane, from level to level, but they're still going from a level of holiness and piety that is able to catapult them to a whole higher level of holiness and piety. Masei in contradistinction, inin hatshuva poyel sha'adam nefach lemetzius chadasha. But tshuva transforms the person in a radical way to a completely new entity. Va'ad shal yidei tshuva yachal adam loymar al atzmai b'lashon Rambam Eini oisaya ish asa oisana masim. The transformation is so complete and so radical that, in the words of the Rambam, the person who completes this type of tshuva can actually say about himself, I am not the same person that did those actions in the past. That's not me. I am not that person. And the fruition, the apex, the culmination of this is effectuated through the service of the high priest on Yom Kippur in the Holy of Holies. Umizeh mikabel kol echad mi Yisrael es hakoyach ledalig min hakotza lakotza. And it's from the service of the high priest in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur that every other Jew gets the ability, the spiritual energy to skip, as it were, from one extreme to another. And even to transform him herself to a completely new existence, entity. And now we're in a position to understand the deeper reason in an otherwise interesting law. The big day love on sha'ovid kain gadol behem b'yom hatzayim einay ovid behem pam shniya la'olam ela nignazin b'makam sheyivshot oisam. That the white linen clothing that the Kohen Gadol wore in the Holy of Holies, in that space, were never worn twice. Even if the Kohen Gadol served for many, many, many years, they wore it once, and then they were hidden away in the place where he took them off. Shenamar, like it says, Vanicham Sham, you should leave it there. Dilach seemingly, Madua ein l'shtamish b'isam gadim b'shana ba. Why would you not use this in clothing? Kishar kol bigdei kayin gadol. Everything else the kayin gadol used, everything else he wore, was used from year to year. There was no statute of limitations on how many times the Kohen Gadol could wear all the other vestments. So why on these clothing, the white linen garments, this limitation of one time alone? And just to point out, these were very finely made garments that could last a very long time. They weren't coming from Shein, So like, why do they have to be put away after being used once? But the explanation is based on what was said above. Ki b'chol pam shakoyin hagadol nichnas l'kodesh hakadashim nasa al yedei avadasai lemetzius chadasha legamrei. Every time the Kohen Gadol went into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, he became a new person completely. Afilu legabe mitziusei b'Kodesh HaKadoshim eshtakad. Even relevant to who he was last year in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. In other words, you might say, okay, in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Kohen Gadol is at, the apex of his holiness. But the Rebbe is saying that he became completely transformed. So the next year he was completely different, even as compared to how he was the year before in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. It's not just that he goes higher. But rather he is changed, he is transformed to a completely new entity. And therefore his clothing has to be completely new. It can't be the clothing from last year. And especially because there was something about these garments that actually effectuated greater honor and greater glory on the Kohen Gadol, in addition to who he already was at that time. And now we're in a position to understand what this term parhedron is broadcasting in a positive way. Kohanim elu ha'erichu yamim begashmias. These kohanim, there were kohanim that lived a very long time, physical years. Aval beruchnias hayu machlifin oisem kol shneim asar chodesh. But spiritually, they were transformed every 12 months, like the parhedron, like the officers for the king. Ki al yedei knisasam lekodesh hakadashim nasu mitzius chadasha. Because through going into the Holy of Holies, they became completely new entities. V'nimtza sha'kohen hagadol shenichnas b'shana zu lekodesh hakadashim einoi oisa kohen gadol dishtakad. And the kohen gadol that went in to the Holy of Holies this year, Yom Kippur, was not the kohen gadol that went in last year. He might have been the same physical person, but he was not spiritually the same person. Tess.
Ishtakad means last year?
Yes. Lefi bir zeh muvan. Based on this explanation, is understood. Shetoichen ha'inyan de parhedrin, kefi shehu lemal yusa, yeshna b'chol hazmanim, gam b'vayis rishon ubetchilas bayis sheni, kshahiyu kohanim gedolim ksherim tzadikim sherichu yamim. So now that the Rebbe has given us the positive explanation for parhedrin, so we understand that the content, that this energy, that this connotation of parhedrin was also present during the first Beis HaMikdash and during the era in the second Beis HaMikdash, when the Kohanim Gedolim were pious and they were righteous. Ubazeh yuvan mashakol Rabbeinu Hakadosh b'Mishnah as Beis Hashemas hein lishkas ha'etz v'hein lishkas parhedrin. And now we understand why the Rambam included both. Rabbeinu Hakadosh is the redactor of the Mishnayos, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. Why did he use both of these terms? Lishkas Yehuda Nasi, sorry. Yes, thank you. Why did he use? Okay, now I'm going to explain why Rabbi Yehuda Chassid is on my mind. Very, very quickly, I'll just explain that Rabbi Yehuda Chassid wrote a sefer, a tzava, a last will and testament. And there are a lot of things delineated there. And one of those things is that when you leave your home and you forget something, you shouldn't go back into the house. And my Zayda once had to go on a trip, and he went to the airport, and this was before COVID and the implosion of the aviation system. This didn't happen very often then, but it happened that the plane was canceled. So he had to go home. But how's he going to go home? He left the house. Rabbi Yehuda Chassid said, you shouldn't go back. So from the airport, he calls the maskiros, he calls the Rebbe's office, and he says he has a problem. So they go in to ask the Rebbe what he should do. And the Rebbe said he should learn a Perek Tanya. And after you learn a Perek Tanya, you're completely transformed. So now he's going to be able to go back into the house because he's not the same person that left the house. So halavai that, I don't know, that I should be able to learn a Perek Tanya, that should transform me on this level. But I was thinking about Yehuda Chasna. I was thinking that after the class I would share the story. But thank you, Rachi, for correcting me and for bringing me to that. Okay, and she's smiling because she knows the story. Okay, so now we understand why Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi included both of these terms in the Mishnah. Ki beis shemos elu roimzim l'shnei oifane avodah shatzichim lias b'kohen gadol, because these two terms actually allude to two modalities of service that need to be present in the kohen gadol. There has to be the eitz, which the Rebbe's father explained. There has to be the wood, the tree, that the Rebbe's father explained has to do with chesed, with kindness. Shezeu inyan avodas hatzadikim. And there has to be the parhedron, there has to be avodas hatshuva, as explained earlier, because tshuva is all about not being satisfied with the status quo, breaking through, like the parhedron that were constantly changing, constantly rotating. V'yesh leima shezeh matim gam in bir Avi, Adoni, Avi, Mori Rabbi. And in the brackets, the Rebbe says that this, we might say that this also aligns with the explanation of my father, Batevas Parhedrin, that the Rebbe's father, Levi Yitzchak, taught that in Parhedrin, Shehira Mezes Ledinim, that the very word Parhedrin alludes to the idea of dinim or givura, severity. Ki tevas parhedrin morkeves misholosh tevas, because the word parhedrin is a combination of three subsidiary words: par, a bull; har, mountain; din. Din means judgment. Shekol achas mehen moral initial din. Ayin sham befratius. Okay, I must admit that I was not able to look into the teachings of Rabbi Yitzchak to understand in greater detail how par, har, how those words have to do with dinim, with severity. I'm guessing, but this is just a guess, that the par bull alludes to the idea of having to bring a korban. So a korban is the idea of tshuva, and maybe it was brought in the Beis Hamikdash. That was on Har HaBayis. But if anybody has learned L'chotei Levi Yitzchak on the word parhedrin, and you could tell us after the sikha, we would all be grateful. Ki avodas hatshuva kshura b'dinim ugvuros, because tshuva is always connected with judgment and strength. Habal tshuva tzarich lasos la'atzmai gedorim usyagim shelo yachzor l'surei. Because one of the things that Baal Tshuva has to do is create parameters and create buffer zones so they never go back to what it is they did earlier. And this is the avodah shel gvura v'din. And this takes strength, this takes discipline. Ubichlal hatnua de tshuva hi b'fchina smol deicha. And more generally, the idea of tshuva has to do with pushing something away. That with the right we embrace, and with the left side we push away. It's about a person feeling kind of low, and when they look at themselves, they feel regret and remorse at how far they were from God in the past. And they also feel badly and lowly about the constrictions and the obfuscations that they created through their sins for Elokus. And now, the Rebbe says, we're going to drill further down in specificity, and this is going to further explain, it's going to further sweeten not just why Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi included both of these terms, but where he used each term. He referred to this cubicle as Lishkas HaEitz b'Mesechet Midas. In the part of the Mishnah of Midas, that's where he calls it Lishkas HaEitz. And he refers to Lishkas Parhedrin in the part of Mishnayos in Mesechet Yuma. Ki hachiluk bein beis hamesechtos hu ka'hefer shebein avodas tzadikim l'avodas tshuva, because the difference between Midas and Yuma is the difference between tzaddik and Baal Tshuva. Taiche Mesechet Midas shayach l'avodas tzadikim kibir Adoni Avi Mori Rabbi. The content of Mesechet Midas is aligned with the spiritual service of tzaddikim, like my father explained, like the Rebbe says about his father, that his father explains. Sheba Meseches Midas, Mayri ech nivna habayis hasheni betchila. That's where it teaches us about how the second Beis Hamikdash was built. Or betchilas bayasheni hare hayu kahanim tzaddikim. And in the beginning era of the second Beis Hamikdash, the kahanim gedolim were tzaddikim; they were righteous. V'yesh leimar. And the Rebbe says in brackets that we might say that because it's so simple and so glaringly obvious, loy pirish v'hitgish, my father did not articulate and he did not underscore two other things about the correlation between tzaddikim and midas. Asher aleph, midas hu loshen midah, that midas is etymologically linked to the word midah, which means measure. V'zeu teichen ha-mesechet, v'hadavar moira al avodas tzaddikim shi b'seder v'hadraga, midida v'hagvala. Midah is about measurement, and that is a good way to understand the avodah of tzaddikim. Everything is measured, everything has parameters, everything is orderly. So correlates with tzaddikim. And Beis, the other thing that my father didn't mention because it's so glaringly obvious is Amru Chazal. Chazal taught in Gemara Yuma, Manhu Midas, who authored Mishnayos Midas, Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov. And what do we know about Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov? The Mishnasei Kavinaki, that his teachings were short and clear, or as we would say today, short and sweet. Kedugmas avodas tzaddikim, and that aligns with avodah of tzaddikim. Shehi binyane or leloy taruvas chayshech. That the avodah of tzaddikim is crystal clear. It's a place of light, and there's no admixture, and there's no amalgam with darkness. Masei Maseches Yuma. But in contradistinction, what's the energy of Maseches Yuma? Teichnahu avodas Yom Kippurim, avodas tshuva. Yuma is all about what happened to Beis Hamikdash Yom Kippur. And what's that? It's all about tshuva. Yud. Al pi kol hanal, yuvan gam hatam sha'eit delishkas kohen gadol hayatzarech liyos mechusa besid. And now we're in a position to circle back and understand on a deeper level, not just on the technical level, why it was that the cubicle of the Kohen Gadol had to be made out of wood, but the wood had to be plastered over. Ki hachidush da'avodas Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim einoi inyan avodas hatzadikim ela hatshuva. Because the novelty of the avodah of the Kohen Gadol is not about the avodah of tzaddikim. Even when the Kohanim Gedolim were righteous and pious and they were tzaddikim and they lived for a very long time, as alluded to in the idea of eights of wood. But what was the whole energy? Tshuva. V'im kain, masha mudgash b'zeh eina ini darichas yamim, ella b'muva misuyam lehefach, hayes hakoyin limitzias chadasha. So what's being hinted here is not so much the arichas yamim, the elongated life that is symbolized by the wood, because trees last for a very long time, but rather, in a certain way, what's being alluded to is the opposite, that the Kohen Gadol was being transformed. Not that he was living a long time in the same way, just another year, same person, another year, but the same person, but rather the way in which he was completely a different person. And this is the idea of ischatshus, and this idea of teshuvah, renewal, and returning to Hashem. Ela she'afal pikein, but even so, hine Hashem parhedrin loy nisan ela la'achrei shebo kohanim gedolim shelo hayu kedeboi. But even so, this beautiful, new, radical, positive interpretation that the Rebbe gave us for Parhedrin, that name did not surface until after the Kohanim Gedolim were not the way they should have been. Ki kol zman shahayu Kohanim Gedolim tzadikim mitzad zeh sheklolos hadar hayu b'dargas tzadikim azay af shavayis hakohen gadol b'yom kippurim hi avodas hatshuva kanal hayu ze beikar inyan shel tshuvas hatzadikim. Because up until the time where the Kohanim Gedolim were no longer pious, okay, you had Kohanim Gedolim that were tzaddikim, which reflected the fact that the whole generation were tzaddikim, but even though on Yom Kippur the avodah of the Kohen Gadol was about tshuva, but it was in the main tshuva as a tzaddik does tshuva, which is not really the fullness of what tshuva is. It's tshuva relative to tzaddik, but it's not the epitome of tshuva. Ukiyadu, as is known, she'inyan tshuva eina rak alaveras elal arichu mekadosh baruch hu mitzad yeridas haneshama lemata beguf utnua zu the tshuva yeshna gam tzaddikim. And the Rebbe says, as is well known, the Alter Rebbe taught us in Likutei Torah that tshuva is not only for something he did wrong. Tshuva is because the default of a soul is that in coming down to be embodied in this world, it is now at a distance from God. And so tshuva is about coming closer. And this is a type of tshuva that tzaddikim do. But it's not the classic tshuva, and it's not the deepest type of tshuva, because tzaddikim don't have a tshuva that is the tshuva that is compared to emerging from a parched land in which you felt that you were in the shadow of death. The tshuva of tzaddikim doesn't have that energy. It doesn't have that urgency. Al kain hatzimayin shalahem b'tshuva tzaddik eina b'toikev u'barash gadol shalamayla mimitid b'hagbala legamrei u'mahaytaima shema lishka hu lishka sa'etz. And so, because the tshuva of a tzaddik doesn't come from this place of urgency and this place of terrific harshness, so their tshuva can't be so strong, and it can't be with such noisiness, as it were. It can't be with an energy that transcends all parameters and all limitations. And for this reason, during that time, it was called Lishkas Ha'etz. It was called the cubicle of wood, rather than the cubicle of Parhedrin. So now what the Rebbe has done is not only unveil that Parhedrin could be positive, but now he has put Parhedrin over Eitz. He has explained the well-known idea that that in the place where a Baal Tshuva stands, complete tzaddikim can never alight to that high level. So it's specifically during the era when the Kahanim Gedolim were not the way they should have been. They were not righteous and they were not pious. And this reflects the whole generation. It was during that era that the avodas hatshuva of the high priest on Yom Kippur, which he effectuated for the whole generation, was the tshuva kipshuta, the classic tshuva. Tshuva zu maitzias adam mikol medidis b'agbalais acha hifeches oisei lemitzias chadash legamrei. That type of tshuva, that type of classic tshuva, takes a person out of all constraints and all limitations until it transforms the person into a completely new entity. I'm going to open the chat and see the... okay, so Chana Fine's first question was answered in the Sikha. Chani Shem Tov asks, so was the problem with those people a disconnect from their innermost self and will, so that it didn't impact their actions on a day-to-day basis? Kind of like the problem we all have, disconnect with the will of our neshama. Yeah, I think last week's Sikha was it last? No, sorry, mixing it up with something else. But yeah, as is famously known, the famous expression that you can have a thief that prays to God that his thievery should be successful. So he believes in God, and he even engages in prayer, and then he goes on to do what Hashem tells him not to do. Chana Fine is saying that Har, Dinim were all given on Har Sinai. Thank you, perhaps. And also that this is like yesterday's Hayom Yom, the avodah of the Pnimi needs to be hard. Yeah, Chana's referencing the Yom Yom of yesterday, that it's not appropriate to ask for bracha, that transformation of the self should be easy, because that's oxymoronic. That the tshuva, that avodah, that us becoming Yiras Shamayim, whatever it is that we hope to become, that it's not, we're not going to get it through Instacart. It has to be something that we work on hard. And Bechlal, it looks like this is something that the Rebbe wanted from us, because right away in the first mimer, Basilagani, the Rebbe says, don't talk yourself into it that I'm going to do all the work for you. You're just going to ride on my coattails. We're going to do this together. Okay, so now everybody can unmute themselves. Maybe we'll shut the recording. We'll start the Farbrengen. I'm going to wish everybody a wonderful week, and I'm